What's going on with the market reforms in Argentina? What have other countries done to fix their social security programs? And how did FedEx change the world? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the Argentinian Code of Government Regulations, which is vanishing beneath our feet as we speak. Towards the end of 2023, Javier Milei was elected the president of Argentina. He was a free market economist and sort of an outsider to the Peronist political establishment that has controlled Argentinian politics for a very long time. He has implemented some dramatic economic reforms in that country, and I wanted to know how they're going. And to do that, I've got Daniel DiMartino on the show. He is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he's been paying closer attention than I have to what's going on. And so want to learn from him and hopefully share that with you as well. So thanks for coming on, Daniel.
Thank you for having me. I love talking about this. And yes, I'm obsessed about what's happening in Argentina. And I think we all should be, because it's truly the most important free market reforms in the world in many, many decades.
Yeah. So can you set the stage for us? What was Argentina like, the last couple of years before Milei took office?
Yes. So everybody is aware, I think, the people who are interested in economics at least, that Argentina used to be a very rich country in the early 20th century. It received a lot of immigration. And then over time, it slowly became a middle income and then really just a third world country. Not necessarily culturally, but certainly economically. They didn't lose their democracy, at least. But in the last year before Milei came to power, that is 2023. So for context, Milei got elected in November 2023 and was sworn into office in December of 2023. So essentially, he's only been president all of 2024 and half of this year, so a year and a half. And the last month before he came into office, inflation was running at about 20% a month. That's 20% every single month, not a year. Like the US highest inflation rate was about 10% in the 70s a year. That is not even 1% a month. In Argentina, now they're heading actually to 1% a month, finally, after all these years. So, they were on the verge of hyperinflation. They already had shortages of gasoline because there were price controls. There were shortages of other goods and services. The economy just was not growing. In fact, GDP finally peaked now under Milei and overcame its previous peak. It hadn't grown for 10 years. Like total real GDP hadn't grown despite a larger population. So GDP per capita was falling in Argentina for 10 years. And this was all under the Peronist regime. The Peronists have been in power for many decades. The only time they really were not in power were for 4 years of Macri, 2015 to 2019 or so. He attempted what was understood as gradual reforms, like gradually balancing the budget and all of this. He totally failed. And the Peronists came back to power. Hyperinflation almost happened. And Milei came in and really saved it. And within the first month in office, he really totally turned around the government's finances and changed everything. And now I think Argentina is on its way to becoming a developed country as long as Milei and his party stay relevant or in power.
So he did this all very quick. That was sort of the difference, like you said, compared to past efforts to try to change things in Argentina. What were some of the things that he did? You mentioned, government budget, but what are some of the specific actions that he took, yes, and why was it important to do it fast?
So first, the president of Argentina has a lot of power, especially in an inflationary environment, because how the budget law in Argentina is written, it's that the government needs to spend what the Congress passes in its budget nominally, which The problem is Congress, for political reasons, underestimates future inflation. So they always have to pass amendments to the budget if they need to increase it. And the issue for the leftists was that when Milei came into office, they couldn't pass a new budget because either they didn't have the majority, they couldn't with the people on the right in Congress, or Milei would veto it, and they wouldn't be able to overturn his veto. So the consequence was the previous budget, there's no shutdown, there's no government shutdowns in Argentina. The previous budget is just extended. But because inflation was over 100% a year, that means that the previous budget was 50% smaller in real terms. And Milei just kept it. And that meant he could adjust it up with the revenue up to the revenue amount. So he could have a zero deficit or he could have a little surplus. He chose to have a small surplus, and he cut every single part of the government. But some parts were cut at nearly 100%, other parts were cut slightly. So, for example, they stopped all federal national infrastructure projects. You might say, well, that's an investment, that's not consumption, that's a problem, right? In reality, in Argentina, these projects were plagued by corruption. The contracts were awarded to friends of the Kirchners and the previous government, so it was a very good thing that they did that, and the provinces should just handle infrastructure. I'm totally in favor of that. Argentina is not as much of a centralized country as other Latin American countries. The provinces do have revenue. But he also went and said, and the provinces need to be financially independent. We are going to stop all transfers to the states. Imagine if they did that in the US, that would be a big deal too. Imagine no Medicaid transfers, no like all these other programs. And a lot of the anti-poverty programs in Argentina were also managed by NGOs, nonprofits. And this was also part of a corruption scheme. So what the NGOs did is that they actually were even allowed to, like legally, to keep a share of the government's money and then give out the rest in form of like jobs, training programs or whatever to people. It was an insane left-wing corruption scheme. All the NGOs were leftists. Milei just cut everything down, and he used the money in the form of a child tax credit so that he could reduce child poverty. It went directly into the pocket through the tax code to Argentinians, and there were no intermediaries, and he still reduced spending on it. So these were some of the major reforms. Obviously, he stopped all hiring of government workers, and all the temporary government workers or recently hired ones were let go. And so he's let go, I believe it's over 5 to 10% of the government's workforce. That's very significant, especially in Argentina. Transportation subsidies, energy subsidies, pensions have not increased with inflation for the elderly. They have increased in nominal terms, but they are actually falling with inflation slightly. That is a very obviously unpopular cut, but it's the biggest one, right?
Yeah. What about rent control? I've heard stories about the rental market in Buenos Aires.
Yes. So, well, on the deregulatory side, a lot has been happening. One of the first things he did in his first month was this massive executive order, which was essentially a list of like 1,000 executive orders in one, because the president does have a lot of regulatory emergency power that then Congress, by the way, passed into law. He convinced Congress, including the moderates in Congress, to pass it into a law. So now it's set in stone. But essentially, he repealed all rent controls. He repealed all price controls. That's pretty basic free market econ policy. But then, he did a lot of really interesting things in deregulating specific industries, in mining, in oil production, which is very important because Argentina has a lot of uranium. Argentina has a lot of steel. And Argentina also has a lot of oil and natural gas. There's a new field that's just growing called Vaca Muerta, dead cow. It's the name of the oil field. It's very, very important. On agriculture, so before, to export anything, you had to register with the government, pay a tax. Now you don't have to register with the government for anything. They just also did this incredible, or at least it's in the process of ending, in the IRS here, if they accuse you of owing them money, you're the one who has to prove that you don't owe them. That was the same in Argentina, not anymore. Now the government has to prove you're guilty. right? You're innocent to proven guilty. Like everything's changing. Airlines, now foreign airlines can fly to Argentina and between Argentina and airports. That is not common around the world. Like in the US, Lufthansa cannot fly between Miami and Dallas. They can only fly from Germany to Miami or to Dallas. And that is a huge issue, right? Because it reduces competition. And that is especially now, maybe in the US it's not as big of a deal because it's the biggest market. But in Argentina, it is a big deal because only very tiny airlines existed inside the country. So, people took buses because it was cheaper. Now they can fly more cheaply. Goods can travel faster. He's reduced taxes on exports. The Argentina still has some taxes on exports. So many things. They're now undergoing the actual tax reform for the income tax. They have not really done a lot of tax reform so far. It's been mostly just, we need to cut spending, balance the budget so that we stop printing money because that was the source of our inflation.
And what about trade? Milei sometimes gets compared to Donald Trump in international comparisons. Does he share Trump's view of trade?
No, Milei is completely for free trade, perhaps even more than I would be on some issues, like, even with China and things like that. So he just believes that the government's role is not to restrict trade. And his goal and what he's working on is exactly that. The issue for him, though, is that Argentina forms part of Mercosur. So Milei can lower trade barriers in many ways, and he has, but the tariff rates the minimum tariff rates on foreign goods are set by this international agreement that Argentina is stuck with for now many years. And it's why Milei has been trying to negotiate a Mercosur European Union free trade deal. But he said that if after he's done with inflation and all these like internal reforms, if that's not been able to happen, then he's going to pull Argentina out of Mercosur and just do unilateral free trade, which I think is interesting. So right now they only have like essentially free trade with like the neighbors. Yeah.
Gotcha. One of the things, Milei talked about doing a lot of this stuff. He talked about abolishing different departments of the government. He talked about, basically his mission in government being to reduce inflation, and voters responded to that by voting for him. One of the things that he talked about doing and hasn't done is dollarization. Can you talk about what dollarization means first, and then why he hasn't done that yet?
Yeah, dollarization is just a process of ditching the domestic currency in favor of the US dollar. I guess you could do with other currencies like the euro or things like that, which, by the way, some countries in Europe have done, like Montenegro, Euroize. I don't know. I think people still call it dollarization, even if it's not the dollar, but it's generally the dollar because it's the world's reserve currency. So that was a big part of his platform. He even campaigned with massive dollar bills with his face on it. And the chainsaw, of course. So, the issue is not that he's not going to do it. I think he will. It's a question of steps. So he has balanced the budget. After balancing the budget, inflation has come down. Inflation is still running above 1% per month. That is, he's still running up approximately at 20% annualized. That is still too high. And so I think they're waiting until that's done. They're going to need a change in the law. They can't just do this by executive order. And it's going to be difficult for them to garner the votes in Congress right now. And I think they're waiting after the midterms, which are in October of this year. So after the new Congress takes office late in the year, I think that's when, they're going to have that discussion. So that's number one. The other reason is that the central bank had to get rid of all its debt. And that's been an issue because the way the previous governments, how they financed their deficit was through the central bank. And let me explain exactly how. So the central bank issued like interest-bearing liabilities that the private banks would buy, and the interest would be tied to inflation. So the banks would just do that to stop their pesos from losing value. And then that money that the banks lent to central bank was given to the federal government that then used to spend money. The problem is that balance was ever growing. So private banks were not lending to individuals. for private lending. There was no investment because they knew the best investment was just safe inflation rate of return with the central bank. So this totally crashed the economy, the private economy at least. It was effectively massive crowd out, right? It's the government lending from the private banks. And so the problem is that when Milei gets into office, even though he stopped the new deficit, the central bank still owned all these interest-bearing liabilities that they had to pay interest onto the private banks, that if they just paid off to the private banks in fully with the principal, they would need to print insane amounts of money to pay them, and then inflation would skyrocket. And so he had to wind them down slowly. And he did that by, first, when he balanced the budget and stabilized inflation, the central bank lowered the effective federal funds rate. And so the interest on those liabilities kept falling as inflation went down. And he ran a constant surplus to begin paying back those liabilities, and he transferred them from the central bank to the treasury. So now the central bank doesn't have those liabilities. That stopped like early this year. That's new. And now the issue is that they still do owe money, right? They owe money to the IMF. They owe money to other dollar-denominated debts. A lot of people on the right were criticizing Milei for getting a loan from the IMF. I think it's important to understand that what really happened is they paid off dollar-denominated debt with a new loan. And the difference is that the new loan has a lower interest rate than the previous dollar-denominated debt because it's an IMF loan. And he has built a great relationship with the IMF president because nobody has been able to balance a budget in a month, especially not one with over 10% of GDP. That's insane. Think about what 10% of GDP is. 10% of GDP in the US would be like $3 trillion. Imagine cutting spending alone by $3 trillion in the US. We can't. It would be impossible. It would be like eliminating the Department of Defense, Social Security, and Medicare all together. And the fact that Milei did this, and he did it by like not destroying his popularity. And in fact, there was a new poll, and like he still has like 55% favorability nationally. And you ask people, why do you like him? 75% mention the economy. And the main word they mention is chainsaw, that they like the chainsaw, the spending cuts. Like, what a cultural revolution that this crazy TV guy could become president out of nowhere and then make balanced budgets his core platform and make it popular. And then the kids stop him in the street to take pictures with him because it's the young people, not the old people who like him. Well, because the old people lost some of their pensions, not the young people. But it's amazing.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the popularity aspect because, you know, a lot of the stuff you described, you know, it might be a good idea from economic policy point of view, but sounds like it could be unpopular if you're taking away government benefits that people were getting, that they were relying on. You know, even if it was unsustainable from the government's point of view and from taxpayers' point of view, that doesn't mean that people weren't relying on it. And so, you know, once he got in power and actually started doing all of this stuff, was there a sense of buyer's remorse by voters or have?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think people understood that Argentina was headed for hyperinflation and things were really bad. There are no shortages anymore. Now inflation is very low compared to what it was before, and people do feel that. The economy is growing, more jobs are created. There's lower poverty rate today than before, and it's falling. You know, he has this really great phrase. He's really a master in political marketing. You know, his main quote is "Viva la libertad, carajo," which means "Long live liberty, damn it!" And that's like what he yells at the end of every speech. But he has this other great phrase that is, "I do not want to raise sheep. I want to liberate lions." Meaning, he doesn't want people to be followers. He doesn't want people to be dependent on the state. He wants them to be independent, to create their own future, to be rich. That's really incredible. And you know, his background was only that he studied economics, he got a master's, he worked in like a bank for a little bit, but then he was essentially just a TV commentator. And then after that, he ran for Congress with who is now his VP. They both were together in Congress. They were the only two members of their party. And then after that, he just became president. He won. He won to the second round instead of the other center right candidate, and then he won the national election. And I think if there was another election today, he would win by a much larger margin. Because there will be less hesitancy. People thought he was a crazy guy before, right? Now he's like, oh, he's not crazy. He just speaks a little crazy, but his ideas have worked. Yeah, so I think Milei's doing really well. He's also profiled himself as a really good international leader, meaning he's been able to build a really good relationship with the US under Trump. He has a really good relationship with Israel. He has a really good relationship with really every leader of the free world, except the Prime Minister of Spain, by the way, who they have intense hate for each other. And the Prime Minister of Spain, like, even threatened to like embargo Argentina. It was an entire issue because Milei called him like a crook and stuff. And anyway, it was a whole issue, but which is. Like Milei is right on this.
And what about what about other leaders in South America? Because obviously, Brazil has a socialist president. Venezuela, yes, of course, has a socialist dictator. How is he getting along with other countries in South America that don't share his views?
Milei does not mince words. He has called, obviously, Maduro everything you can imagine. He, in fact, got into a big diplomatic issue, and the Argentinians were expelled from Venezuela because he gave refuge to the Venezuelan political refugees inside his embassy in Caracas. So he really stands for freedom. With Brazil, they just have a cordial relationship, but Milei has said in the past that Lula is truly a crook, which is true. And so it's not that good of a relationship with the left-wingers. But I think people need to understand that what happens in Latin America is not really just ideological differences. Is that Lula was a convicted crook, meaning like he stole money from the government. He became rich from government contracts. Like Milei is not a rich guy. Milei does not become rich from government contracts, unlike all these other people. And I think he really cares about integrity. He has a really good relationship. It's really funny with Meloni from Italy, the Prime Minister of Italy. There's so many memes about that. And what I like about him is that he unabashedly says that I want Argentina to be aligned with the West. I want Argentina to be aligned with America, with Israel, with what is good and against tyranny. And so he very much speaks against Russia, in favor of Ukraine, in favor of Israel, against Hamas. He just signed a treaty with Israel, actually. And so there's also a very long-standing connection of the Jewish community in Argentina. He himself was in the process of becoming Jewish. He had to stop, he said, because of the duties of the presidency. But it's a really interesting man.
Yeah. And can you tell us about the dogs? Because he has cloned dogs, right?
Yes, that's when I say interesting too. That's a little too much for me, but he had one dog and then he cloned it, and I think he has now 4 of them. And he also has a staff like to stand on, where he has the heads of the dogs in the stick. And the dogs are named Milton, Murray, and then like what's the other name? Like it's all from Austrian economists and like Milton Friedman. It's super funny. He's had several girlfriends while he's president too, like several relationships in a year and a half. It's truly an incredible time to be alive. But look, to me, what's exciting is he has a vision for Argentina of making it a really rich country within a couple decades. He wants to make Argentina the freest economy in the world. If he is allowed, he certainly can do it. And he's maintaining his popularity. My hope is he will win these midterms elections in October. He will be able to pass even more economic reforms and dollarize, such that if the Peronists come back into power later in the future, they cannot inflate away the deficit. And if he does that, then he will probably be one of the best presidents, honestly, in the Western world's history, like up there with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The thing is, he just needs to solidify his legacy. I hope he wins re-election in 2 years. And if he does that, he will have 8 years total, plus bigger majorities in Congress. Like, he really has a chance to transform Argentina or transform a country like no one ever has. I was saying before, people talk about the Chilean miracle, right? Like in the 80s, but this is so much better. This is so much bigger, both in size, because Argentina has 3 times approximately the population of Chile. And then the fact that the Chilean miracle was done under a dictatorship. And that has stained it in a way, right? This has been done democratically. Not only democratically, but it's also much deeper, the reforms. Like, Pinochet was not a libertarian economist, okay? Like, Milton Friedman was not president of Chile. We essentially have like a Milton Friedman president of an entire country right now. And it's incredible.
Yeah. I get excited about that. And when I hear people like you talk about it, it always gives me some hope. But at the same time, in the back of my head, I always think, but it is Latin American politics, right? Like what's the catch? What's the problem? So what you mentioned he's got the midterm elections coming up this year, and then his own reelection in 2 years. So those are obviously future things that could be challenges for him that he has to overcome. But what do you think are, policy wise, what do you think are the biggest challenges still out there that he needs to see through in order to make sure that his legacy is as positive as it could be?
Well, I think that he needs to pass a few things in Congress that are very key. Number one, they do need to reform the tax code. So they do have a lot of things that they need to do and not as much time, which is why I think they need another term. It's not even been half of his term, to be fair, but I think he'll need another one. So number one, they need tax reform. They need more permanent pension reform. They need dollarization. That all needs to be done by legislation. Those are already 3 major legislative things that need to pass. That's a big deal. And the challenge is he's so far successfully avoided the social issues that are controversial and divisive in Argentina, kind of 50-50, like abortion. And even though he's very pro-life, he's totally like let go of that issue to focus on the economy, which I think is the right move right now. As much as I want to, have no abortion or no deaths of the unborn, the truth is that it would probably result in him losing the election later. So he's something he can do in his second term. So that's the kind of thing that is going to be challenging. Trade-wise, the Mercosur, I think, is an obstacle. I do think that Argentina should leave Mercosur and just have unilateral free trade. I think he can do that. The advantage of Mercosur is that were the Peronists to come back into power, yes, the Mercosur, it's kind of like forced protectionism, but also caps protectionism from the Peronists. Mm-hmm. So, that I think ending all forms of export taxation is important, key in all of this. And I think the other big challenge that they're going to have is if there's a global recession that is not of his fault, right? That may be very negative for him. I was thinking the other day that perhaps even the tariff war of Trump, if it doesn't result in a recession, it might actually be positive for Argentina. Because not only does it make the rest of the world more relatively better to invest, but also, think about what tariffs do in the U.S. They make the U.S. dollar more highly appreciated, right? Especially, or fewer people want to buy things in the U.S. too, right? Or exports also fall. What does the U.S. export? Food. A lot of food, a lot of beef, a lot of animal products, a lot of corn, a lot of soy. That's exactly the competition of the Argentinian exports. Mm. So suddenly Argentinian agriculture became more attractive to buy things from. So I think that's beneficial for Argentina.
And what can we learn in the U.S. from this? You mentioned that the budget picture looks very different here than it does there. Politically, Milei has been able to do a lot of these things on his own, but he's done it completely constitutionally, just because the Argentinian constitution actually gives him a lot more power than the U.S. Constitution gives to our president. And so, different constitution, different culture, different continent. What are some things that are transferable that we can learn from?
I think, what is not transferable is to do a massive budget cut immediately, because we're not in the path to hyperinflation imminently. So there will be no political capital for that. But I do think that there is an exaggerated fear to spending cuts. I think, if you were to freeze Social Security increases for a year, nothing would actually happen. I think that, if you did a lot of Social Security reforms, Medicare reforms, Medicaid reforms, there would be no massive backlash at all. I think it's exaggerated. I think Argentina showed it. I was reading something from the American Enterprise Institute the other day. I think Andrew Biggs wrote that if Bush had passed his Social Security bill in 2003 or something, today, 2/3 of the Social Security deficit would be gone. In fact, the poorest would be making more money in Social Security, and the middle class and the rich would be making a little less. Nobody would have died. Everything would have been fine. It's all fear mongering. Just go and pass them. Get through it. It will be fine. It's not going to cause a recession. And I think that that's what we need. Also, with a lot of other policies, I think it's that way. I think people tend to coalesce around the leader if the leader is all in. I think also just integrity matters. I think the fact that Milei was trusted as somebody who, he might be crazy, but he's not a thief. He's not a crook. He's not a liar. He's telling us what he actually believes. I think people respect that and like that. And I think Trump has in part some of that. I think if Trump were to support entitlement reform, the entire base would rally around him. Even if some influencers complain, that's not going to change things, and nobody would die, and it will all be fine.
So what it sounds like you're saying to me is that markets actually work, and markets
work so well. It's incredible. In every country, in every culture, in every language, in every religion, free markets work. Now, politically, I understand it's different. It depending on where you are. But Argentina shows that free markets can save you very quickly, much quicker than anybody would have anticipated. And those same ideas would work here.
All right. Thanks so much, Daniel. This is great.
Amazing.
So while there's plenty to learn from Argentina's experience, there's also things that we can learn from other rich countries, not just countries that are trying to become rich, about how to reform retirement programs. The basic cause of the financial troubles that the Social Security program is in, and those troubles are significant, the basic cause of it is that we have an aging population. Now, the exact design of the Social Security program is pretty unique to the United States. Countries do these things differently in different places. And of course, our exact problem is really ours alone. The Social Security's trustees report, which comes out every year and gives an update on the finances of the program, said that in 2033, under current law, Social Security benefits will be cut by about 23% on average, because that's the year that the trust fund accounting mechanism will officially run out of money. Now, Social Security has been running deficits every year since 2010, so it really already is out of money. But there's various accounting gimmicks that the government uses to make it last longer. But those will be up in 2033, according to the Social Security trustees. That's only 8 years away. This isn't some far-off theoretical thing anymore. And the U.S. is a real outlier in how generous Social Security benefits are, especially for people who already have lots of retirement savings. The basic design of the Social Security program is to be an income replacement program. It is not to be a welfare program. A lot of times when you talk about reforming Social Security, people's minds immediately go to poor seniors. And poor seniors do need Social Security. But most seniors are not poor. Most of them are middle class or upper class. And the senior poverty rate is lower than the overall poverty rate. And the way the government calculates the senior poverty rate is that it doesn't include retirement savings. So the real rate of seniors who are actually in poverty is much lower even than the already low rate that the government reports. And so there's lots and lots of opportunity and room for reforms of the Social Security program. Like I said, the basic reason for it is that we have an aging population. As countries become rich, people, on average, live longer and choose to have fewer children. There's a variety of reasons for both of those things that are not important to get into right now. But these are generally true across all rich countries. As they become richer, people live longer and choose to have fewer children. That means programs for retirees that were designed under the assumption that people wouldn't be living as long and that more people would be younger and working no longer work. The finances of those programs no longer work. Other countries have reached the point of insolvency faster than the United States has, and they've made reforms. And others have gotten out in front of it and made reforms so they don't have to get to that point. There's a new paper out from Romina Baccia and Ivana Nakebia from the Cato Institute that talks about some successful reforms in other rich countries. Countries that have aging populations just like we do in the United States. They look at 4 different examples: Germany, Canada, Sweden, and New Zealand. So let's start with Germany because the German system is probably the most similar to U.S. Social Security system in its structure. They have a thing called statutory pension insurance, which is based on earnings replacement, just like Social Security is. So the idea is people who earn more during their working life have paid more in payroll taxes and therefore get more benefits when they retire. The purpose of the program is to replace the earnings that you had when you were working with money that was taken from you during your career. That program is, like the US one, is slightly progressive, and most senior income in Germany does come from government benefits. So your average German retiree is pretty dependent on the government program. So that makes it hard to reform. We see this all over the world. But, unlike in the US, German politicians have reformed the program in response to the aging population. One of the biggest things that they did was they adopted something called a sustainability factor, which is an automatic balancing mechanism that links the growth in benefits year over year to the ratio of retirees to workers. So every year, pension system has a benefit increase to keep up with inflation and things like that. U.S. has, we call it the cost of living adjustment in the U.S. for Social Security. And in the U.S., that adjustment is based on the inflation rate. So if inflation's higher, the increase is larger. If inflation's lower, the increase is smaller. But it uses a measure of inflation that actually overestimates how bad inflation really is. So what ends up happening every year is that Social Security beneficiaries do not simply get an adjustment to keep up with inflation. They actually get a real increase in their benefits. This might have made sense when the government had more money, but we have enormous deficits now, and this is not sustainable. Now, Germany has this cost of living adjustment too, but they have this stabilizer that says if there are not enough people working to pay for the retirees, it's going to reduce the growth of the benefit. So they've, instead of just relating it to overall macroeconomic factors, they added this sustainability factor, which relates it to the finances of the program itself. So this is a smart thing to do, so that benefit growth automatically reduces in response to adverse demographic trends. Makes it easier to weather recessions because you don't have benefits growing at unsustainable rates all the time. So that's one idea. Canada has a very different retirement system from the US. We have a very one-size-fits-all approach here in the US, but in Canada, they have a more personalized system. So they have one retirement program called Old Age Security that's pretty much universal, and that provides a flat monthly benefit. So that's a difference between the US and Canada, because in the US, remember, it's about earnings replacement. Canada's Old Age Security is truly a safety net. It says we're going to set this level below which senior income cannot go, because we're going to have this universal benefit for all. If your goal is preventing senior poverty, that's a good way to go about it. That's better than earnings replacement. Because again, seniors who are making, six figures during their career, they're not at risk of going into poverty in general. That's not something that they need to worry about. It's not something public policy needs to worry about. But it is something that Social Security, in effect, does. So Canada has that flat monthly benefit. Then on top of that, there's a means-tested program called Guaranteed Income Support. And that gives more money to lower income retirees. So that's where the sort of social welfare instinct comes in and says we should not just make sure that people aren't in poverty, but we should do something to sort of equalize people's incomes in retirement. And so we're going to have this means-tested program for people with low incomes to bring that income up even higher. Then they have a thing called the Canada Pension Plan, and that is earnings related. And Canada also has a thing called universal savings accounts, which are tax-advantaged accounts that can be used for anything, but are often used to save for retirement. So you put all of that together. Different parts of it apply to different people. Not everybody has exactly the same set of benefits. But you put all that together, Canada has a very low senior poverty rate, lower than the United States, and it spends 2.59% of its GDP on those two retirement programs, Old Age Security and the Guaranteed Income Support means-tested program. So the universal program and the means-tested program together cost Canada about 2.59% of their GDP. The United States spends over 5% of our GDP on Social Security. So Canada is spending, as a share of its economy, about half as much money on income support programs for seniors, and it has a lower senior poverty rate than we do. That should tell us something about how to run these programs, that maybe the Canadians are onto something. Now let's look to Sweden. Sweden used to be a bastion of socialism. Back in the 20th century, they had a long run of social democratic party governments that implemented all kinds of socialist programs. And Sweden still lives on in people's memory as this huge welfare state. And in some respects it still is, but in the 1990s, Sweden did exactly what Margaret Thatcher said would happen with socialism, which is it ran out of other people's money. And so in the 1990s, they reformed that welfare state. And a big part of that was reforming their Social Security program. And so the Swedish retirement program is partially privatized. That crazy free market idea that is so politically toxic in the United States is already a thing in Sweden. So we should keep that in mind. So the privatized portion supplements the government portion. They invest these savings in the market. Many benefits are means tested there as well, and the eligibility age is indexed to life expectancy. So the U.S. has had this problem of raising the retirement age, and this becomes a very contentious political debate because if you just choose random times to increase the retirement age, and if you do it by anything more than, a couple months even, you can cause real problems for people who were planning around the retirement age being what it was earlier in their career when they were making their retirement savings decisions. And so what Sweden has done is they've indexed that rate or that age that you can collect benefits to life expectancy. So it goes up as life expectancy goes up. So that removes those very difficult political decisions by just making it automatically go up as people live longer. That really increases the sustainability of the program because you can forecast out in the future based on actuarial tables what the benefits will be. And people planning for retirement can plan around that as well. And so it's a very useful thing to do. Another thing that Sweden has done, Sweden has had a lot of immigration, especially in the last 20 years. And immigration causes problems for welfare states. Because now all of a sudden you have new population that you didn't expect to be there taking benefits that were originally designed for the population that existed earlier. And it can also provide a magnet for immigration. If you want to be a magnet for immigration, you want it to be because people want to work, not because people want to take government benefits. And what Sweden did is they said, if you've lived in Sweden for less than 40 years, so someone who moves to Sweden as a child, that doesn't count. But for people who move when they're adults, if you've lived in Sweden for less than 40 years before you retire, your Social Security benefits are reduced in proportion to the number of years below 40 that you've lived in Sweden. That's a pretty smart decision, too, to keep programs sustainable and to make sure that people aren't being attracted to your country for the wrong reasons. Sweden also has another automatic stabilizer that reduces benefit growth if liabilities exceed assets in the fund. So it's a little bit like the German automatic stabilizer, but instead of being related to demographics, it's directly related to the financial status of the program. Sweden, for having all of these supposedly terrible market-based ideas in their retirement program, Sweden has the lowest senior deprivation rate in the EU. And they spend less than 1% of their GDP on means-tested programs for seniors. It's working. And the program's sustainable. And the final example that the paper looks at is New Zealand. The system they have there is different from every other rich country. They do not have in New Zealand any mandatory retirement programs that the government forces people to participate in through a dedicated tax. So in the U.S., you have to pay your payroll tax, and that payroll tax goes to pay for Social Security. That basic funding mechanism, even though the programs look different, that basic funding mechanism is in place in basically every rich country, except New Zealand. New Zealand, they do not have any mandatory retirement programs. What they have is similar to the Canadian flat benefit. They have a thing called New Zealand superannuation, which is funded with general revenue, not a dedicated tax. And it's a safety net for seniors that provides a floor for income. It's not super generous, but it's just enough to say, look, you're not in poverty. We're going to take care of you and make sure you don't go into poverty. And it's just funded with general taxation. Then the government encourages people to participate in a voluntary program they have called Kiwi Saver. Kiwi is the nickname for people from New Zealand. And that program, allows seniors to save for retirement in a tax-advantaged way. It's good. But they just encourage people to participate. Most people do. But there's no mandatory taxation involved with it. And New Zealand has a lower senior deprivation rate than most European countries do. So it's working out just fine there without having the coercive aspect of our Social Security program and most retirement programs around the world. So the approaches in these four countries, as you can see, are very different from each other. But all of them are more sustainable, make more sense, and are getting better results than Social Security. And it's also important to note what these countries didn't do. They did not rely on tax increases to keep benefits growing. The successful reforms were not based on keeping benefits growing. They were based on getting spending under control. Now, some of these countries have definitely imposed some tax increases as well. But the core of the reform and the reason the reforms have worked long term is because they got the spending side under control. Because the demographics are against you. They're against every country as it becomes richer. You have to get the spending side under control if you want these reforms to work. Congressional Budget Office estimates that in order to make Social Security benefits keep increasing like they're increasing right now, to make that sustainable in the long run, we'd have to increase the payroll tax from about 12% to about 16%. So that's like a 35% tax increase. Is it worthwhile to people to have that much higher of a payroll tax in order to keep funding benefits that we all know are unsustainable? Or should we get the benefits under control and let people keep more of their own money? I know which side I'm on. So one of the great free market success stories in the United States in the last, 50 years or so, is the development of the logistics and transportation industries. Now, yes, there's a lot of government involved in transportation. Government built and financed roads, government-owned airports, that sort of thing. And I'd love to see a lot of that stuff privatized. Airports especially. But within that system, the U.S. has allowed a lot more market mechanisms to work. And it has improved the results for everyone. And a lot of it actually comes from Jimmy Carter, which you might not expect. He's sort of known as being a very left-wing president. But he undid a lot of price controls that Richard Nixon had put in place. And he led pretty broad deregulation of a lot of the transportation sector. They did this in several different laws. For airlines, for trucking, for railroads. And overall, these have worked really well. But you still need entrepreneurs who are going to come in and make a difference. Government can get out of the way, and that's good, but that's just the first step. People actually have to go out and make the difference because government doesn't actually produce these services. And so one of the people who did that was a guy named Fred Smith, who just passed away recently at the age of 80. He was the founder and he was the CEO until 2022 of FedEx, originally called Federal Express. It was founded by Fred Smith. And the idea he got was actually from a paper he wrote in college in 1965, before a lot of this deregulation happened. He saw a new market opening up for overnight package delivery. And his idea was there's all these high-tech businesses. And again, this is high-tech by the standards of 1965, so this is before modern IT revolution and all these other things. He said there's these high-tech industries who are going to have demand and they're going to have money to want packages delivered overnight because they're delivering very expensive things that are time sensitive. And they need to be able to count on somebody to do that. And how air freight worked at that time, and how most air freight still works today, is it's carried in the bottoms of passenger planes. And that's fine. It makes a lot of sense. But it means that packages only move when and where passengers do. And it also means that people that want to ship packages have to try to coordinate with trucking companies and railroads who don't work with the airlines and are not basing their schedule on the airline's schedule. And so there's all sorts of delays and mistakes that can happen along the way. And so what Fred Smith said is, there should be a company that just does the whole process. We'd have planes that just carry cargo, and we'd have a network of trucks that would take those packages and deliver them directly to customers. And that became FedEx. FedEx still does that today. They deliver the package, they pick it up from you, put it on a truck, put it on an airplane, put it on another truck, and then give it to the other person you're delivering it to. They control the whole process start to finish. And they do it through an enormous hub in Memphis, Tennessee. The hub and spoke system was also one of Fred Smith's ideas. And he said that this would allow for big economies of scale, making stuff cheaper and more efficient. So he took this idea from his college paper and he turned it into a multi-billion-dollar company. It's got to be probably the most important college paper ever. FedEx struggled at first, but with the help from deregulation, they were able to succeed. FedEx, on average, today delivers about 185 packages per second. It's a global company. They do this all over the world. It's the largest cargo airline in the world. They got about 700 airplanes. And all of their motorized vehicles on the ground number to about 200,000. They employ over 500,000 people in the world, 370,000 in the US. And their website processes 500 million package tracking requests every day. That's significant because FedEx actually invented the tracking number. That very normal idea that we're very used to now, that they came up with that. And it began as an internal practice, and then they made it visible to their customers to search where packages were. They started putting barcodes on packages. That was them. And Fred Smith was always sensitive to the gains in productivity that come from new technology. FedEx was very early to computerization in transportation. They had an internal computer system as early as the late 70s. They created their own wireless network in the 80s before cell phones. And they were the first transportation company with a website that allowed customers to track their packages on the internet, beginning in 1994. Smith said that the information about the package is as important as the package itself. That was a brilliant insight. Because really, before FedEx, you knew where a package was picked up from, and you knew when it eventually got delivered. But if you wanted to know where it was anywhere during that process, no one really knew. Because it was working with all these different companies, and There was no tracking number. And so FedEx really sort of invented this idea of you could actually know where your shipment is as it goes on its way. And so this was, Fred Smith really was a visionary leader in American business for seeing this stuff coming, getting out in front of it. And then, there's some luck involved here too, because what he didn't see coming was this boom in e-commerce. When he wrote his paper in college, he was thinking about FedEx primarily as a business-to-business delivery company that would help these high-tech businesses that needed really specialized things done very quickly. And FedEx still does a lot of that today. But they also have this huge business-to-consumer market as well, from people ordering stuff online. And then when FedEx started doing this, UPS started doing it too. UPS has been around much longer than FedEx has. But UPS really became a different company to better compete with FedEx. And then you've got companies like Amazon today that are trying to do a lot of this stuff in-house. But they're doing so building on the technological advances that companies like companies like FedEx have made. They are very much of that same mindset as Smith of the information about the package is more important than the package itself, and using the next generation of technology beyond stuff like tracking numbers with stuff like drones, which is another area that Fred Smith was actually interested in before he died. And I have to say, Fred Smith was also a big supporter of free markets. He supported tax reforms to the corporate tax code, some of which have happened, some of which have not. And he supported free trade because he realized his company was living proof, still is living proof, that free trade benefits Americans. And it doesn't just benefit rich Americans, it doesn't just benefit Americans on the coasts. It benefits those hundreds of thousands of FedEx employees, about 30,000 of whom live and work in Memphis, Tennessee, where FedEx's giant hub is located. FedEx employs people at every income level, every skill level. It's truly a very impressive American company. And one of Smith's quotes that I think is really great, he said, "There's only two kinds of economic systems, the market-driven and the government-directed. That's it. The more you move toward a state-directed economy, the less efficient and more corrupt it becomes." I think that's a great summary, very much fits with Econception's mission. And Fred Smith was a great American entrepreneur. If you've ever received or shipped a package overnight, you should be grateful to him. He came up with an idea that people didn't think was possible, and he made it into something that billions of people take for granted. That is truly a world-changing accomplishment. Now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Daniel pick the paper of the episode from the National Bureau of Economic Research in May of 2023 by Sandra Black, Leslie Turner, and Jeffrey Denning, Plus or Minus: The Effect of Graduate Student Loans on Access, Attainment, and Prices. Here's Daniel to tell you about it.
So it is the effect of graduate student loans on access, attainment, or prices, plus or minus. It's Sandy Black from Columbia. So essentially, they study the expansion of the federal loan program for graduate programs in 2006. And what they find is that, yes, obviously, more people got loans because they expanded access, but it led to a proportional increase in tuition at graduate programs like MBAs, law schools, med schools, and it did not increase access to grad programs, meaning the entire graduate student loan program is a waste of federal taxpayer dollars that leads to people getting in debt, and that just allows grad schools to make a ton of money from the federal government. and leaving the students on the hook for the debt, right? It would be better for a prospective lawyer to be $100,000 in debt with a bank than $200,000 in debt with the federal government, even if the interest rate is a little higher. Like the difference in the debt size is just much larger, right? So that's one of the things that I learned from that, and that I think should help us reevaluate a lot of the programs that we have the government involved in, like the student loan program.
Plus or Minus by Black, Turner, and Denning. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.